One of history's greatest empires has almost disappeared from popular memory. When people think of the ancient world, they imagine Rome's legions, Greece's philosophers, or Egypt's pyramids. Yet centuries before Rome reached the height of its power, another empire stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River. It governed millions of people across 3 continents, pioneered innovations that later empires would adopt, and reshaped the political map of the ancient world. This was the Achaemenid Persian Empire, a civilization often remembered only through the eyes of its enemies. Its greatest mystery is not how it fell, it's why history largely forgot just how remarkable it was. To understand ancient Persia, we must first travel to a world that looked completely different from our own. Nearly 2,600 years ago, the Near East was not dominated by a single superpower. Instead, it was a patchwork of kingdoms and empires competing for territory, trade, and survival. The Assyrian Empire had once ruled through overwhelming military force, becoming infamous for brutal campaigns that intimidated rivals into submission. But by the late 7th century BCE, Assyria collapsed under the combined pressure of internal instability and external enemies. In its place emerged several ambitious states, including the Neo-Babylonian Empire in Mesopotamia, the Kingdom of Lydia in western Anatolia, and the powerful Kingdom of Egypt. Farther east, beyond the Zagros Mountains, lived numerous Iranian-speaking peoples who had gradually migrated onto the Iranian plateau over centuries. Among these groups were the Medes and the Persians. At first, the Persians were not a dominant civilization. They occupied a relatively modest homeland in the region known today as southwestern Iran. Their territory, called Persis or Parsa in Old Persian, was mountainous, strategically located, and rich enough to sustain local kingdoms, but it was hardly the center of the ancient world. For many years, the Persians themselves lived under the political influence of the Median Empire, whose rulers controlled much of western Iran. Nothing suggested that this small kingdom would soon establish the largest empire humanity had ever seen. But geography quietly favored Persia. The Iranian plateau sat at the crossroads of civilizations. To the west lay Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. To the east stretched Central Asia and the routes leading toward India. To the south was the Persian Gulf, opening maritime connections across the Arabian Sea. Whoever united these regions could command trade, armies, resources, and ideas moving between continents. This strategic position would become one of Persia's greatest advantages.
The 6th century BCE was also a period of extraordinary political change. Kingdoms constantly formed alliances, broke treaties, and fought wars for regional dominance. Military innovation accelerated, iron weapons became widespread, cavalry grew increasingly important. Larger armies demanded more sophisticated logistics and administration. Power no longer depended solely on battlefield victories. It increasingly depended on the ability to govern diverse populations spread across vast distances. That challenge would define Persia's greatest achievement. Into this changing world stepped a ruler whose origins remained partly obscured by history, but whose impact would be impossible to ignore. His name was Cyrus II. Known to history as Cyrus the Great, he inherited leadership of the Persian kingdom sometime around 559 BCE. Ancient sources, particularly Greek historians such as Herodotus, blend historical events with legendary stories about his childhood, making it difficult to separate fact from later embellishment. Modern historians therefore rely not only on literary accounts, but also on Babylonian records, inscriptions, and archaeological evidence to reconstruct his reign. What emerges is the portrait of an unusually capable leader. Around 550 BCE, Cyrus rebelled against the Median king Astyages. Rather than ending in prolonged civil war, Many Median nobles reportedly shifted their loyalty to Cyrus. The result was more than a military victory. It was the peaceful absorption of the Median state into what became a new Persian-led empire. Instead of destroying Median institutions, Cyrus incorporated them. Median elites retained important positions within the new administration. This decision reflected a governing philosophy that would distinguish Persia from many earlier empires. Conquest did not necessarily mean annihilation. It often meant integration. That principle soon transformed the political landscape of the ancient world.
After consolidating control over Media, Cyrus turned west toward Lydia, one of the wealthiest kingdoms of the era. Ruled by the famously wealthy King Croesus, Lydia controlled prosperous cities, valuable mineral resources, and key trade routes connecting Asia Minor to the Mediterranean. The campaign ended with the capture of Sardis, Lydia's capital. Persia suddenly inherited not only immense wealth, but also direct contact with Greek city-states along the Aegean coast. These encounters would shape centuries of history. Yet Cyrus was only beginning. His next objective lay farther south, Babylon. Few cities possessed greater symbolic importance. Babylon was renowned for its enormous walls, monumental architecture, sophisticated scholarship, and deep religious significance. Capturing it by force seemed almost impossible. Yet, in 539 BCE, Babylon fell to Cyrus with remarkably little destruction. Ancient Babylonian sources, including the famous Cyrus Cylinder, present the conquest as a relatively peaceful transfer of power, portraying Cyrus as a legitimate ruler chosen by the city's chief deity, Marduk. While historians debate aspects of this narrative, recognizing that royal inscriptions were often political documents, it is widely accepted that Babylon experienced far less devastation than many ancient conquests. Cyrus adopted an approach that proved remarkably effective. Rather than dismantling local traditions, he publicly respected Babylonian religion, restored temples, and allowed displaced communities, including many Jewish exiles, to return to their homelands. This policy was not simply an act of generosity, it was a sophisticated strategy for governing an increasingly diverse empire. Instead of forcing every population into a single cultural identity, Persia often sought stability through accommodation. That flexibility became one of its greatest strengths. Within just a few decades, the Persian Empire stretched across an extraordinary expanse, from Central Asia to the Eastern Mediterranean, from the Caucasus to the borders of Egypt. Never before had one political system governed so many different languages, religions, cultures, and ethnic communities. The challenge was unprecedented. Winning territory had been difficult. Holding it together would prove even harder. And the solution Persia developed would influence imperial governance for centuries to come.
Conquering an empire is one challenge. Building one that lasts is another entirely. When Cyrus the Great died around 530 BCE during a campaign in Central Asia, according to most historical accounts, likely against nomadic peoples known as the Massagetae, he left behind far more than conquered territory. He left an empire unlike anything the ancient world had seen, but it was also fragile. It stretched thousands of kilometers across mountains, deserts, fertile river valleys, and coastlines. Without a system to hold it together, it could easily have fragmented into dozens of competing kingdoms. The first test came almost immediately. Cyrus was succeeded by his son, Cambyses II. Unlike his father, Cambyses inherited a functioning empire rather than creating one. His greatest military achievement was the conquest of Egypt in 525 BCE. At the Battle of Pelusium, Persian forces defeated the army of Pharaoh Psemtik III, bringing one of the world's oldest civilizations under Persian rule.
For the first time in history, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Anatolia, and much of the Iranian plateau were governed by a single imperial authority. Yet, expansion came with risks. While Cambyses campaigned abroad, political instability emerged at home. Ancient sources disagree on exactly what happened after his death in 252 BCE. Some describe an impostor posing as Cambyses' brother Bardia. Others argue that the man may have actually been the legitimate prince. Because most surviving accounts come from Darius himself or later Greek historians, modern scholars acknowledge that the full truth remains uncertain. What is clear is that a succession crisis threatened to tear the empire apart. Into that crisis stepped a nobleman named Darius. Later known as Darius the Great, he claimed the throne after defeating rival claimants across the empire. His famous inscription at Behistun, carved high into a cliff in western Iran, presents his victories as the restoration of legitimate order against rebellion. While modern historians recognize the inscription as royal propaganda intended to legitimize his rule, archaeological evidence confirms that Darius spent his early reign suppressing numerous revolts across multiple provinces. Only after securing the throne could he begin his true achievement. He transformed Persia from a collection of conquered lands into one of history's first highly organized imperial states. Darius understood something many conquerors did not. Military victories create empires. Administration preserves them. Rather than attempting to govern every province directly from the royal court, he divided the empire into administrative regions known as satrapies. Each satrapy was governed by a satrap, often translated as governor, who oversaw taxation, local administration, justice, and public order. At first glance, this resembled simple decentralization. In reality, it was a carefully balanced system. The satraps possessed significant authority, but they were never completely independent. Military commanders answered separately from civil governors. Royal secretaries reported directly to the king. Inspectors, known by later Greek writers as the king's eyes and ears, traveled throughout the empire, investigating corruption, monitoring officials, and ensuring loyalty to the crown. Power was deliberately divided. No single governor could easily build an independent kingdom. For an empire spanning nearly 5 million square kilometers at its height, this administrative innovation was revolutionary. Communication became equally important. Orders issued by the king meant little if they required months to reach distant provinces. So the Persians invested heavily in infrastructure. Their greatest achievement was the Royal Road. Stretching roughly 2,500 kilometers from Susa in southwestern Iran to Sardis in western Anatolia, this network connected major administrative centers across the empire. Relay stations positioned along the route allowed mounted couriers to replace exhausted horses with fresh ones, dramatically increasing the speed of communication. The Greek historian Herodotus admired the efficiency of this system, writing that neither snow, rain, heat, nor darkness prevented the royal messengers from completing their journeys. Whether slightly idealized or not, the observation captured an important reality. Persia had created one of history's most effective long-distance communication networks. Information became a strategic weapon. Governors could request assistance, military units could receive orders, taxes could be coordinated, intelligence could flow toward the royal court with unprecedented speed. Long before the telegraph or the internet, Persia recognized that empires depended not only on armies, but on information. The empire's economic system also became increasingly sophisticated. Rather than eliminating local economies, Persian authorities generally allowed regional traditions to continue while introducing greater standardization where necessary. Under Darius, the empire issued gold coins known as darics alongside sigloi. Although local currencies continued to circulate in many regions, standardized imperial coinage facilitated taxation, long-distance trade, and commercial confidence across an enormous territory. Merchants benefited enormously. Goods could move across thousands of kilometers under the relative security provided by Persian rule. Phoenician ships carried products across the Mediterranean. Caravans transported textiles, spices, precious metals, timber, ivory, and luxury goods across Asia. Agricultural surpluses from Egypt supported populations elsewhere. Ideas, languages, artistic styles, engineering knowledge, and religious traditions traveled alongside commerce. The Persian Empire did not merely connect territories, it connected civilizations. This integration became one of its defining characteristics. Unlike many earlier empires, Persia generally avoided forcing conquered peoples to abandon their languages or religious beliefs. Local elites often remained in office. Temples continued to function. Regional legal traditions survived under imperial oversight. This policy was not based on modern concepts of equality or democracy. It was practical statecraft. Suppressing every local identity would have required constant warfare. Accommodation often proved cheaper, more stable, and ultimately more effective. Of course, Persian tolerance had limits. Rebellion was met with overwhelming force. Those who accepted imperial authority frequently enjoyed considerable autonomy. Those who challenged it encountered one of the largest and most disciplined military machines of the ancient world. That military reflected the empire itself. Persian armies were multinational. They included Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Lydians, Bactrians, Scythians, and dozens of other peoples, each contributing specialized skills, equipment, and regional expertise. Perhaps the most famous unit were the Immortals, numbering approximately 10,000 elite soldiers, according to Greek sources. They earned their name because every casualty was immediately replaced, maintaining a constant fighting strength. Whether the figure was exact remains debated, but the symbolism mattered. The Immortals projected permanence. They embodied the image of an empire that seemed impossible to exhaust. Yet, despite its immense power, Persia soon encountered a challenge unlike it had faced before, not from another empire, but from a collection of fiercely independent city-states scattered along the shores of the Aegean Sea. Their conflict would become one of the most famous rivalries in ancient history, the Persian Wars. And for centuries afterward, those wars, recorded primarily by Greek historians, would shape how much of the world remembered Persia itself. When most people think of ancient Persia, they think of one event, the Persian Wars. Films, novels, and popular culture often reduce the empire to a single image, an unstoppable Eastern superpower confronting a handful of determined Greek city-states. It is an unforgettable story, but it is also an incomplete one. To understand why Persia and Greece collided, we have to look beyond the battlefield. The conflict began not because Persia sought to conquer Europe for its own sake, but because of unrest within its own empire. Along the western coast of Anatolia lived the Ionian Greeks. Although culturally Greek, these prosperous cities, including Miletus, Ephesus, and others, had become part of the Persian Empire after Cyrus conquered Lydia. For years, they enjoyed considerable autonomy under local rulers supported by Persia. But in 490 BCE, the balance collapsed. The Ionian revolt erupted when several Greek cities rebelled against Persian authority. The rebellion gained outside support from Athens and Eretria, which sent ships and soldiers across the Aegean. From the Persian perspective, this was no minor disturbance. It was foreign interference inside imperial territory. Although the rebellion was eventually crushed, Darius I reportedly resolved to punish the Greek cities that had aided the rebels. The stage was set for one of antiquity's defining confrontations. In 490 BCE, Persian forces crossed the Aegean and landed near the small coastal plain of Marathon. The Athenians, heavily outnumbered according to many traditional accounts, though modern historians debate the exact figures, chose to fight rather than wait behind their city walls. Against expectations, the Greek hoplites broke the Persian lines and forced the invaders to retreat. Militarily, Marathon was an important but limited setback for Persia. Politically, however, it became something much larger. For the Greeks, it symbolized the possibility that even the world's greatest empire could be defeated. For Persia, it represented unfinished business. Darius I died before organizing another expedition. His son, Xerxes I, inherited both the empire and the unresolved conflict with Greece. Unlike the relatively limited campaign at Marathon, Xerxes prepared an invasion on an unprecedented scale. Ancient writers describe enormous armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands or even millions, though modern scholarship considers those figures highly exaggerated. Most historians believe the Persian force was still extraordinarily large by ancient standards, likely consisting of tens of thousands of soldiers drawn from across the empire.
The logistical challenge alone was astonishing. Engineers constructed pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, allowing troops to cross from Asia into Europe. Supply depots were established months in advance. Roads were improved. Fleets coordinated with land forces. This was not simply a military expedition. It was one of history's largest logistical operations before the Industrial Age. As the Persian army advanced into Greece in 480 BCE, many Greek city-states faced a difficult choice. Some resisted, others surrendered. Still others attempted to remain neutral. The image of a united Greece confronting Persia is largely a product of later storytelling. In reality, the Greek world was deeply divided. One of the most famous episodes unfolded at the narrow pass of Thermopylae. King Leonidas of Sparta, accompanied by a small coalition of Greek forces, attempted to delay the Persian advance. The battle has become legendary because of the Spartans' last stand. Yet strategically, Thermopylae achieved something equally important. It bought time. Time for Greek cities to prepare. Time for fleets to reposition. Time to organize resistance. Although Persia ultimately captured the pass and advanced southward, the campaign was far from over. Soon afterward, Athens itself was evacuated. The city was occupied and burned. For a brief moment, it appeared that Persia had achieved victory, but control of Greece depended on more than occupying cities. It required command of the sea. That command would be decided at Salamis. Themistocles, the Athenian strategist, convinced the Greek fleet to fight within the narrow straits near the island of Salamis. The confined waters reduced Persia's numerical advantage and limited the maneuverability of its larger fleet. The result was a decisive Greek victory. Xerxes returned to Asia, leaving part of his army behind under General Mardonius. The following year, in 429 BCE, Greek forces defeated the remaining Persian army at Plataea. Together, Salamis and Plataea effectively ended Persia's attempt to subdue mainland Greece. For generations, Greek historians portrayed these victories as the triumph of freedom over tyranny. Their writings profoundly shaped Western historical memory. Yet there is another perspective. Despite losing the campaign in Greece, the Persian Empire remained extraordinarily powerful. Its economy continued to flourish. Its administration remained intact. Its territory still stretched across 3 continents. Far from collapsing, Persia would remain the dominant power in the Near East for another 150 years. In other words, Greece survived. Persia endured. That distinction is often overlooked.
The Persian Wars were enormously significant for Greek history, but they represented only a relatively small chapter in the much longer story of the Achaemenid Empire. Indeed, Persian influence continued to shape Greek politics long after the wars ended. Greek city-states frequently fought one another during the Peloponnesian War, and Persian diplomacy became an important factor in these conflicts. Persian gold financed shifting alliances. Persian satraps negotiated with rival Greek leaders. Rather than conquering Greece directly, Persia increasingly influenced it through diplomacy, economics, and strategic intervention. Sometimes influence proved more effective than invasion. Back within the empire, construction projects reflected both imperial confidence and remarkable artistic achievement. One city in particular became the symbolic heart of Achaemenid power: Persepolis. Built primarily during the reigns of Darius I and Xerxes I, Persepolis was not the empire's administrative capital. Susa, Babylon, and Ecbatana also played important governmental roles, but it served as a ceremonial center like nothing the ancient world had seen. Its immense terraces, towering columns, finely carved reliefs, and monumental staircases displayed the empire's extraordinary diversity. Delegations from across the empire are depicted bringing gifts to the king. Each delegation wears distinct clothing, hairstyles, and carries unique offerings. The message was unmistakable. Persia ruled not through uniformity, but through the cooperation of many different peoples under one imperial order. Persepolis was more than architecture. It was political symbolism carved in stone. The empire had become a vast network of cultures connected by administration, trade, diplomacy, infrastructure, and law. For nearly 2 centuries, that system remained remarkably resilient. But no empire is permanent. Even the strongest institutions eventually face new challenges. And from the rugged kingdom of Macedon, a young commander was preparing to test whether the world's greatest empire had finally reached its limits.
The rise and fall of the Achaemenid Persian Empire reveals a deeper lesson about power. Empires are not created by conquest alone. They are created by systems. The Persian achievement was not simply that Cyrus, Darius, and their successors conquered enormous territories. Many rulers throughout history achieved spectacular victories. The more difficult question is what happens after the conquest. How do you govern millions of people who do not share the same language, religion, traditions, or history? The Persian answer was one of the earliest examples of what could be called imperial integration. Instead of attempting to erase diversity, the Achaemenids built a framework where diversity could exist under a central political authority. This was not a modern nation-state. The empire did not seek to make everyone Persian. It sought to make different peoples part of the same imperial structure. That distinction was revolutionary. The Persian model of imperial governance. Earlier empires often relied heavily on direct domination. The Assyrians, for example, had built a reputation for harsh military campaigns, mass deportations, and psychological warfare. Their methods were effective in expanding territory, but created constant resistance. Persia inherited a different problem. Its empire was too large to control through fear alone. A soldier could conquer a city. A governor could collect taxes, but neither could create lasting stability without cooperation. The Achaemenids understood that local elites were valuable political assets. A Babylonian administrator who understood local traditions was often more useful than a Persian official who did not. An Egyptian priesthood that accepted Persian rule could help maintain order. A Phoenician merchant fleet could strengthen imperial trade. A Lydian financial network could increase economic power. The empire's strength came from turning former rivals into participants.
This approach created a political ecosystem where conquered peoples often had reasons to maintain the system rather than destroy it. However, this should not be misunderstood as equality. The Persian Empire was still an absolute monarchy. The king possessed supreme authority. Taxes were collected. Armies enforced imperial decisions. Rebellions were crushed. The empire offered flexibility, but not independence. Its success came from balancing local autonomy with imperial control. Infrastructure as a tool of power. One of Persia's greatest innovations was understanding that infrastructure was not merely about transportation, it was about control. The royal road was not just a highway, it was an imperial nervous system. Information moved through it, orders moved through it, military forces moved through it, economic resources moved through it. A distant province thousands of kilometers from the royal court could still be connected to the center of power. This solved one of the greatest problems of ancient government: distance. Before large communication networks existed, rulers often struggled to know what happened beyond their immediate surroundings. A rebellion could grow for months before a king even heard about it. Persia reduced this vulnerability. The empire created systems for rapid communication, standardized taxation, administrative reporting, military coordination, long-distance trade protection. These ideas influenced later empires. The Romans, Byzantines, Islamic caliphates, Mongols, and many other imperial systems would face the same fundamental challenge. How do you govern enormous spaces efficiently? Persia did not invent every solution, but it created one of the earliest sophisticated answers. The economics of empire. The Achaemenid Empire was also an economic machine. Its wealth came not from a single resource, but from controlling a network of productive regions. Egypt provided agricultural abundance. Mesopotamia provided fertile land and urban centers. Anatolia supplied precious metals and trade routes. Central Asian regions contributed horses, livestock, and valuable goods. The Persian Gulf connected maritime commerce. Instead of replacing regional economies, Persia connected them. This created something resembling an ancient global economy. Not global in the modern sense. There were no worldwide financial markets, industrial factories, or instant communication, but the basic principle was similar. Different regions specialized in different resources, and imperial networks allowed those resources to circulate. The empire benefited from economic diversity. A drought in one region did not necessarily destroy the entire system because wealth and supplies could move across imperial routes. This was one reason the empire remained powerful for so long. Its strength was distributed. Military power beyond the battlefield. The Persian military is often misunderstood. Greek sources sometimes portrayed Persian armies as massive but inferior forces defeated by smaller, more disciplined Greek soldiers. This interpretation became dominant because many surviving accounts were written by Greeks. But the historical reality is more complex. The Persian military was one of the most advanced forces of its time. Its greatest advantage was not a single elite unit. It was scale and flexibility. The empire could recruit soldiers from dozens of regions, each bringing different capabilities. Persian cavalry was highly effective. Horse archers from Central Asian regions provided mobility and ranged attacks. Infantry from different provinces brought specialized weapons and experience. Phoenician sailors strengthened naval operations. Egyptian and Babylonian engineers contributed technical expertise. This was an imperial army in true sense. It reflected the empire itself. However, diversity also created challenges. An army composed of many cultures required strong coordination. Different languages, fighting styles, and loyalties could complicate operations. The Persians solved many of these problems through organization,
But the difficulty never disappeared. Large empires always face a tension. The same diversity that creates strength can also create vulnerability. Why did Persia fail against Alexander? By the 4th century BCE, the Achaemenid Empire remained wealthy and powerful. Yet in 334 BCE, a young Macedonian king crossed into Asia with a relatively small but highly trained army. His name was Alexander. The traditional explanation is simple. Alexander was a military genius who defeated a declining Persian empire. But historians debate this interpretation. Persia was not a collapsing state. Its economy remained strong. Its administrative system still functioned. Its armies remained capable. The empire's defeat resulted from a combination of factors.
First, the Macedonian army had developed a powerful military system under Philip II, Alexander's father. The combination of the Macedonian phalanx, companion cavalry, and professional organization created a force capable of defeating much larger armies. Second, Alexander exploited internal political divisions. The Persian king, Darius III, faced challenges within the imperial elite, and Alexander was able to present himself not merely as a conqueror, but as a potential successor to Persian authority. Third, the geography of the empire became a disadvantage. The same vast territory that made Persia powerful also made rapid response difficult. A crisis on one frontier could require enormous resources to address. At battles such as Issus in 333 BCE and Gaugamela in 331 BCE, Alexander achieved victories that shattered Persian military resistance. But the end of the Achaemenid Empire was not the end of Persian civilization. This distinction is essential. Alexander conquered the Persian state. He did not erase Persian influence. In many ways, he adopted it. He retained administrative structures. He used Persian officials. He encouraged cultural exchange between Macedonian Greeks and Persian elites. The conqueror became, in part, the inheritor. This demonstrates one of history's recurring patterns. Power does not always disappear when an empire falls. Sometimes it survives by being absorbed into the civilizations that replace it. The forgotten legacy of Persia. Why then is Persia often remembered less prominently than Rome or Greece? Part of the answer lies in historical survival. Much of what we know about ancient Persia comes through Greek and Roman writers, many of whom viewed Persia as a rival. Victors often shape historical memory. Rome left behind enormous architectural remains across Europe and the Mediterranean. Greece influenced later Western philosophy, literature, and political thought. Persia's achievements were different. Its greatest innovations were often institutional. Administration, communication networks, taxation systems, multicultural governance, imperial organization. These are harder to see than monuments. A road disappears. A bureaucracy leaves fewer visible ruins than a temple. A successful administrative system becomes normal and eventually forgotten. Yet many later states inherited ideas that Persia helped develop. The idea of governing diverse peoples through provincial administration. The use of imperial roads for communication. The combination of centralized authority with local traditions. The idea that a ruler's legitimacy depended partly on maintaining order among different communities. These principles continued to appear throughout history. The Persian Empire was not simply a forgotten kingdom. It was one of humanity's earliest experiments in managing complexity at a continental scale.
To understand why the Achaemenid Persian Empire became one of the most influential states of the ancient world, it is useful to compare it with the empire that would eventually replace it as the dominant power of the Mediterranean, Rome. At first glance,
Persia and Rome appear to represent two completely different models of empire. Rome was built around expansion through military conquest, citizenship, and the gradual integration of conquered peoples into a Roman political identity. Persia, especially under the Achaemenids, followed a different philosophy. Its goal was not necessarily to make every conquered people Persian. Instead, it often attempted to manage diversity. An Egyptian priest, a Babylonian merchant, a Lydian nobleman, and a Persian administrator could all exist inside the same imperial system while maintaining their own traditions, languages, and religious practices. This approach had advantages. A multi-ethnic empire containing millions of people from different civilizations could become unstable if rulers attempted to erase local identities. The Persians understood that loyalty could sometimes be achieved not through cultural uniformity, but through predictable administration and respect for local customs. This was one reason the empire could survive for more than 2 centuries despite its enormous size. However, this model also created challenges. Because local regions retained significant autonomy, the empire depended heavily on strong rulers and capable administrators. When leadership weakened, distant provinces could become difficult to control. Rome faced different problems. The Romans developed a powerful system of military organization, legal structures, and political integration. Over time, conquered populations could gain Roman citizenship and become part of the Roman world. This created a strong sense of shared identity. But Roman expansion also carried enormous costs. Constant warfare required constant military investment. Political struggles inside Rome often became connected to competition for military power. The Persian system and the Roman system each solved different problems. Persia was highly effective at governing diversity. Rome was highly effective at expanding and integrating conquered territories. Neither model was perfect. Both depended on military strength. Both required efficient taxation. Both struggled with the enormous challenge of controlling territories larger than any individual ruler could personally oversee. The comparison also reveals something important about how we view history. For much of modern popular culture, Greece and Rome dominate stories about the ancient world. Their architecture, philosophy, politics, and military achievements are widely studied. Persia is often presented mainly as an opponent of Greece or Rome. But this perspective creates an incomplete picture. The Achaemenid Empire was not simply an enemy defeated by famous Greek armies. It was one of the first true world empires. It created administrative methods, communication systems, and political ideas that influenced later civilizations. Even Alexander the Great, who destroyed the Achaemenid Empire, did not completely erase Persian traditions. After conquering Persia, Alexander adopted many Persian administrative practices and attempted to combine Greek and Persian elites. His successors continued governing much of the former Persian world using systems inherited from the Achaemenids. In this sense, Persia did not disappear. Its political DNA continued inside the empires that followed. Another important comparison is between the Persian Empire and earlier civilizations, such as Egypt and Mesopotamia. Egypt had maintained centralized rule around the Nile Valley for thousands of years. Mesopotamian kingdoms developed early cities, writing systems, and complex administrations. But the Achaemenids combined many earlier achievements into a new international imperial model. They inherited the writing traditions of Mesopotamia. They adopted administrative practices from conquered regions. They used infrastructure ideas developed by earlier civilizations. Then they scaled them across a territory larger than any empire before them. The Achaemenid achievement was not inventing every individual component. It was combining existing innovations into the first truly international imperial system. This may be the greatest historical significance of the Achaemenid Empire. It demonstrated that a state could govern multiple civilizations at once. That idea would become one of the central challenges of human political history.
Despite its impressive achievements, the Achaemenid Empire was not an unstoppable machine. Its greatest strength was also one of its greatest weaknesses: its size. An empire stretching from Central Asia to Egypt and from Anatolia to the borders of India created enormous logistical challenges. Communication between regions could take weeks or months. A rebellion in one province could become serious before imperial forces even received news of it. The royal road improved communication, but it could not eliminate the fundamental difficulty of governing a massive territory before modern transportation and communication technology. The empire also depended heavily on the ability of individual kings. Strong rulers such as Cyrus and Darius created stability through political skill and administrative reform. But succession crises and weaker leadership could threaten the entire system. This pattern was common among ancient empires. A successful founder could build institutions, but maintaining those institutions across generations was much more difficult. Another uncertainty concerns the internal life of the empire. Much of what historians know about Achaemenid Persia comes from sources written by outsiders, especially Greek historians. Writers such as Herodotus provided valuable information, but they also viewed Persia through Greek cultural perspectives. Their accounts sometimes reflected political rivalry, cultural assumptions, or storytelling traditions. Modern historians therefore compare Greek writings with Persian inscriptions, archaeological evidence, administrative documents, and discoveries from imperial sites. The result is a more balanced understanding, but many questions remain unanswered. For example, historians continue debating the exact nature of Persian governance. How much freedom did local populations truly have? How effectively did imperial policies reach ordinary people? How much did ideology versus practical necessity shape Persian rule? These questions remain difficult because ancient empires rarely preserved detailed records from the perspective of ordinary citizens. Most surviving evidence comes from kings, officials, religious institutions, or foreign observers. There are also debates surrounding the reasons for the empire's decline. The traditional explanation focuses heavily on Alexander's military victories. His campaigns were extraordinary, and the collapse of Persian central authority happened rapidly after the defeat of Darius III. But historians increasingly emphasize that the empire's fall was not caused by one battle alone. Internal political instability, leadership struggles, regional tensions, and the pressures of maintaining such a large state all played roles. Alexander succeeded because he attacked an empire that had already become vulnerable. The Persian Empire was not simply defeated by a stronger army. It was a complex political system reaching a moment of weakness. Understanding these limitations prevents a simplistic interpretation of history. The Achaemenid Empire was neither an ancient utopia nor merely a defeated opponent. It was a sophisticated political experiment with extraordinary successes and unavoidable challenges. The story of the Achaemenid Persian Empire may seem distant, separated from the modern world by more than 2,000 years. But many of the challenges it faced remain surprisingly familiar. At its core, the Persian Empire was attempting to solve one of humanity's oldest political problems. How can a government control a vast territory filled with different peoples, languages, religions, and cultures? This question has shaped history from ancient empires to modern nations. Today, countries, international organizations, and global institutions continue to struggle with the same balance between unity and diversity. The Persian approach offers an early example of a system built around managing differences rather than eliminating them.
Modern ideas such as multicultural governance, regional administration, and decentralized political structures have parallels with strategies used by ancient imperial governments. Of course, the Achaemenid Empire was not a modern democracy, and its society was based on systems of hierarchy, taxation, and royal authority. But the administrative challenge it faced was remarkably modern. How do you maintain stability among millions of people who do not share the same language, traditions, or identity? The Persians developed one possible answer: create a common political framework while allowing local societies to preserve many aspects of their own culture. This concept influenced later empires. The Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, Islamic caliphates, and many other large states faced similar questions about administration and identity. The Persian example also matters because it changed how historians understand the development of government itself. Before the Achaemenids, large states existed. Egyptian kingdoms had controlled the Nile Valley. Mesopotamian empires had ruled major cities and agricultural regions. But Persia created something different. It transformed the idea of empire from simple conquest into a system of administration. An empire was no longer only about defeating enemies. It became about organizing populations, managing resources, maintaining communication, collecting taxes, and building institutions that could survive across generations. Many features of modern states have distant historical connections to these challenges. Government ministries, provincial administration, road networks, standardized systems of taxation, official communication channels. These are not inventions of the modern era, but part of a much longer evolution of political organization. The Persian Empire is also relevant when examining the relationship between infrastructure and power. The royal road was not simply a transportation project. It was an instrument of government. Roads allowed armies to move faster. They allowed officials to communicate. They allowed goods and information to travel across enormous distances. This principle remains true today. Modern nations invest in highways, railways, ports, satellites, and digital networks, because infrastructure determines economic and strategic power. In many ways, the ancient Persian Empire understood a principle that still shapes geopolitics. Whoever controls the movement of people, resources, and information holds enormous influence. The empire also provides lessons about the limits of power. The Achaemenids controlled one of the largest territories in human history. They possessed wealth, armies, and sophisticated administration. Yet, eventually, their system collapsed. Their downfall reminds us that no empire is permanent. Power depends not only on military strength, but also on political stability, economic management, leadership, and the ability to adapt. This lesson appears repeatedly throughout history. The Roman Empire, the Mongol Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire. Each reached extraordinary levels of influence. Each eventually faced the same fundamental challenge. Maintaining a complex system becomes harder as that system grows. The Persian Empire also has modern relevance because of its connection to the history of Iran. Although modern Iran is not a direct continuation of the Achaemenid political system, the legacy of ancient Persia remains an important part of Iranian historical identity. Sites such as Persepolis represent one of the world's most significant archaeological records of ancient imperial civilization. They provide evidence of a society that was not only powerful militarily, but also deeply connected to art, architecture, administration, and cultural exchange. Understanding Achaemenid Persia also challenges the way history is often presented. Ancient history is frequently taught through isolated civilizations: Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, India. But the ancient world was not a collection of separate stories. It was a connected network of trade routes, diplomatic relations, conflicts, and cultural exchanges. The Persian Empire was not simply one chapter in ancient history. It was one of the foundations of the interconnected world that followed.
The Achaemenid Persian Empire disappeared more than 2,000 years ago. Its palaces became ruins. Its kings became names carved into stone. Its armies vanished from the battlefield. But the problems it tried to solve never disappeared. How do we govern enormous societies? How do we balance unity with diversity? How do we build systems powerful enough to survive generations? These questions remain at the heart of politics today. The Persians were not the first people to build cities, governments, or armies, but they were among the first to understand that controlling a vast world required more than conquest. It required organization, communication, diplomacy, and the ability to bring different peoples into a shared system. Their empire reminds us that history is not only shaped by battles and famous leaders. Sometimes the most important changes come from the quiet inventions of administration, infrastructure, and ideas. The Achaemenids created a model of empire that influenced civilizations long after their own kingdom fell. And perhaps the greatest lesson from ancient Persia is this: empires are remembered not only for the lands they conquer, but for the systems they leave behind. So when we look at the world today, with its interconnected economies, global institutions, and diverse societies, an ancient question remains: are we still solving the same challenges that the first great empires faced thousands of years ago? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this exploration of forgotten history, consider liking the video and subscribing for more documentaries that uncover the stories behind the civilizations that shaped our world.